Hello, welcome back. I'm Arunima Sarin, and this is the second installment of the video series where we look at the differences between the UK and the US when it comes to getting a PhD in psychology. In today's video, we'll look at the differences between these two countries in terms of their funding. To recap, the first video in this video series looked at the differences between the UK and US in terms of the structure of their PhDs and the duration, the time it takes to get your PhD. In today's video, we'll take a look at a really crucial aspect when it comes to your decision on where to apply, and that is the funding structures. Let's get into it. Before we jump into the details specific to the two countries, there's a couple general points to bear in mind. So when we think about funding in the context of a PhD in psychology, there's three major expenses that entails. The first is your tuition fee. This is money that is owed to the university where you're getting your PhD degree. Now, even though it's supposed to be a degree in training and you also provide services often in terms of, teaching or assistance with research, ultimately you are getting a degree and training from a university. And so all PhD programs have a tuition fee that is owed from the candidate to the university. The second expense is living expenses, often also called stipend. So this is money that the candidate, you, get, and it's meant to help you live your life, pay your bills, buy your groceries for the duration of your degree. The third big expense is any kind of research costs. So this includes money to do research, buy research equipment, publish papers, travel to conferences. So when I talk about funding for a PhD, we're going to talk about the differences between these two countries in terms of all these three pieces. With that aside, let's get into the specifics. Let's start with the UK. A PhD in psychology in the UK typically does not come with funding attached. What this means is that as a candidate, you need to first secure a PhD position and then secure funding to do the PhD. Ideally, the funding you secure should cover all of the three major expenses that we just talked about: tuition fee, living expenses, and cost to do research. When you start looking at different funding opportunities, which we'll talk about in a second, the amount you need to cover living expenses and cost for research is going to vary by virtue of what kind of research you do and where it is in the UK that you live. Naturally, because major cities like London are more expensive than some other towns, and also because different kinds of research cost different amounts. So if you do an online study, you probably have to pay your participants a lot less than if you do an fMRI study. So those two can vary, and the amount of funding by extension that you need to cover those can vary. But the tuition fee that you owe to the university is going to be fixed by the university at which you get your admission. Now, how much tuition fee you owe is going to vary massively by your nationality. And this is specific only to the UK. The UK academic system distinguishes between its students based on their nationality. And there's two big categories. You can either be a home student or an international student. You're classified as a home student if you are a national of the UK, or you have been living in the UK for 3 or more years, and for that duration, you were not getting education. So, put another way, if you were here to get trained, or you were doing another degree, then those 3 years don't count towards your home status. So you just have to be living here or working here for 3 or more years, or you have to be a national of this country. If either of those are true, then you're classified as a home student. Otherwise, you are classified as an international student. Now, here's where it gets crazy. The difference in tuition fee for the home and international students is massive. Home students pay much, much lower tuition fee. So just to give you an example, on average, if you are doing a PhD in a STEM subject like psychology, your average yearly tuition fee is anywhere between £4,000 to £5,000 if you are a home student, but it is a whopping £19,000 to £20,000 per year if you are an international student. So there is a massive difference between the kind of funding you would need because of the big difference in tuition fee depending on your nationality, which is something really important to bear in mind as you think about applying to the UK for PhD. So with that caveat in mind, let's look at some sources of funding. There's 4 main sources of securing funding. The first is research councils. The UK has 7 research councils that provide government-funded grants to cover PhD costs. And these can cover all of the 3 main expenses of a PhD, so tuition fee, living expenses and stipend, as well as your research costs. Now, each of the council has its own area of focus, and so they typically prioritize funding PhD projects that fall within that area. They also typically prioritize nationals, and some often have eligibility criteria, so funding is restricted primarily to UK nationals. But there are some limited funding opportunities within these research councils for international students. A second main source is university scholarships and bursaries. Many universities have internal scholarships that students can apply for to secure funding for their PhDs. The scope of what any of these scholarships or bursaries would cover in terms of the amount, but also the type of funding that you can use them for, varies greatly by the university, by your specific program, and also by nationality. A third main source is charitable foundations and trusts. The UK has several large organizations like the Wellcome Trust or the Leverhulme Trust that provide funding for PhD programs in the UK. Each trust, again, has its specific area of focus, so it typically will provide funding only for projects that fall within its ambit, and the funding is typically structured around the research theme. Finally, a fourth main source is international scholarships. There are several international scholarships available to international students who want to do a PhD in the UK. Some common popular ones are the Commonwealth scholarships, the Chevening scholarships, scholarships from the British Council. Again, each of these varies widely in scope and how much of the PhD cost they'll cover, what kinds they'll cover, and also the specific eligibility. Now, each of these each of these sources of funding do provide you at a shot at getting a fully funded PhD in the UK, but they're also incredibly competitive. Every year, the number of people applying for these scholarships far outstrips the amount of money and resources available. So the competition is really fierce and the application process can be really lengthy and time consuming. Having said that, it is possible to secure funding. For example, I'm an Indian national, and back in 2016, I managed to secure funding from one of the UK Research Council, so specifically the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, for a fully funded PhD that covered 3 years of a PhD plus 1 year of master's, and that funding would have covered my tuition fee, given me a stipend, and some minimal research expenses. I ended up turning it down in favor of going to the US, but there are opportunities. Let's look at the US next. Now, funding for a PhD program in America should also cover all of our 3 main costs, so tuition fee, your stipend, and your research costs. The good thing, though, is that within the American academic system, there is no distinction based on nationality when it comes to tuition fee. So whether you are an American citizen, a green card holder, or an international student, you pay exactly the same tuition, right? There's a flat tuition rate and everybody pays that when it comes to the PhD, which is great because it makes getting funding easier. A second great thing about doing a PhD within the US system is that for most good competitive programs, an offer to do a PhD comes attached with funding. That means you only need to worry about getting in, because if you do, then it will the university or the program that you've applied to will cover anywhere between 4 to 6 years of tuition fee, which goes back into the university, a stipend for the candidate, some minimal research expenses, and cover your health insurance. Now, the way different universities distribute that funding can vary. A couple different ways that universities provide funding. So it can be direct scholarships, it can be through guaranteed teaching positions, through fellowships. Just as like a concrete example, I did my PhD in psychology from Harvard University. I graduated in 2023. So it took me 6 years to graduate. And for the whole duration, I had complete funding from the university. For the first 2 years, when we are required to take classes and sit our qualifying exams, I got my stipend through a scholarship, so I didn't have to do anything to get it. I just needed to take my classes and pass them and do my research. For years 3 and 4, we are guaranteed teaching positions, so we get our stipend, but we have to teach classes to get it. And for the final year of our PhD, we get a dissertation completion fellowship, which is again guaranteed. We just have to fill out a form, and then we get a whole year where we don't have to do anything except focus on writing our thesis. So for the entire duration of 6 years, I had to pay nothing out of pocket, and I got enough stipend to pay my bills, to pay my rent, to be able to go out with my friends. It's not a lot of money. It's not the kind of money that you get if you were doing any kind of corporate job, but it's enough to live your life and get the training and the degree that you want. So it's great. Even though within the US system, PhDs often come with funding, there are external funding bodies that you can apply to get funded. And people often apply to these less out of a need for the funding and more because it's really prestigious to score one of these fellowships because they are incredibly competitive. Some popular ones are NSF, NIH, and NDSEG. It's really great to get funding from these bodies because, like I said, it's really prestigious. It looks great on your CV. But almost all of these funding bodies have eligibility restrictions, and you can only apply to them if you are an American citizen or a green card holder. So as an international student, you are not eligible to apply. Recap, when we compare getting a PhD in psychology between the UK and the US, two key differences emerge that are based on the availability of funding and the applicant's nationality. In the UK, securing funding is a two-step process where a candidate has to first secure the PhD position and then look for funding. The cost varies significantly between home and international students, with international students having to pay much higher tuition rates. Funding can come from research council, charitable institutions, university scholarships and bursaries, as well as international scholarships, each with its own competitive application process. In comparison, in the US, PhD programs typically come fully funded regardless of the applicant's nationality, thus providing a more inclusive financial structure. Funding typically covers tuition fee, living expenses, has some minimal research costs, as well as health insurance, and it's often distributed through direct scholarships, fellowships, or teaching and research positions. Additionally, US students can apply for external funding to really prestigious institutions and organizations like NSF, NIH, and DSEG, but these typically are restricted and international students are not eligible to apply for these. Before we wrap up our discussion, I want to make one little point. Now, if you secure a PhD position, but not the funding, sometimes an option that is floated to help with that is to take on a student loan to complete your PhD. Theoretically, that is an option, but practically, I would advise strongly against it. I don't think that it's a very wise idea to take on a loan to do your PhD, in part because there are loads of different opportunities that are available through universities, through external funding bodies, private institutions, charitable institutions that allow you to do the PhD without taking on that financial burden and that financial strain. Also because depending on where you do your PhD and what type of project and subject you do your PhD in within psychology and what type of skills you have, the job you get right after that might not pay you a lot. Some PhD positions and projects and trainings allow you to get jobs that are really high paying, but some don't. And so you don't want to be in a position where you've taken on a massive financial strain, a massive financial burden, but are stressed about making ends meet. So in general, I would advise strongly against taking on a personal or a student loan to fund your PhD. I understand though that for some people that might be the only way forward. And so if you find yourself in that position, maybe sit down and plan and have a really good understanding of what kinds of jobs your degree would make available to you and what the average salary is. Basically, make an informed and practical decision about how feasible it would be for you to pay off that loan and in what duration, because you don't want to take on this massive financial burden without having to really think through it. That's a wrap on the second installment, where we discussed the difference between the UK and the US in terms of the funding they provide for a PhD in psychology. We will continue with this series next week, so stay tuned. As always, if you thought this video was helpful, please like it and share it with others who might find it useful. Subscribe for more academic content. Check out my website for even more academic content and advice. And stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye.